Thank you. I feel like I should storm into battle. After that introduction, it's like Braveheart or something like that. Well, it's wonderful to be with all of you today. As was mentioned during the introduction of me, what I was asked to do was sort of, all right, let's back way out. Let's do a lens, a very, very big picture of what are the forces that are going to shape the next 10 years. Big picture, big technological shifts that will impact all of our lives at work and at home. But I do have to say, part of why I chose to speak here was because of the audience. I don't think that there is any more important a role in an organization and in our economy than those who are stewarding the learning agenda. And this has always been the case. From the first job I took out of college back in 1994, when I became a sixth grade teacher in West Baltimore through Teach for America. So I think what you are doing is of growing importance. And part of what I hope you'll hear from my remarks, and then I hope we can get into some interesting Q&A, is as much has changed over the last 10 to 20 years. The pace of change is only going to accelerate. And in the midst of very, very fast-paced change, what we are going to be asking for from our employees, from our colleagues, is going to change very quickly, and that's going to be disorienting. And you are going to have to be the stewards of that change within your organization. So I think your roles are only going to grow in difficulty and in importance. Now, by way of doing some framing, I should say it's been a long road since I was that sixth grade teacher in West Baltimore. One of the things that I noticed after a few years of teaching, this is again in the 1990s, shortly after NAFTA, and when globalization was really starting to spin the earth. I recognized that the jobs like where I grew up in West Virginia and where I was teaching in Baltimore, in ports, factories, mines, and mills, that good old-fashioned, well-paid union jobs where you could get a good wage based on the strength of your shoulders, feed your family, single-parent income, those jobs were absolutely evaporating. And I was teaching these sixth graders in a very, very poor community in Baltimore who would have once wanted to go work in the port, the mill, or the factory, and recognized that, there was absolutely no future for them there. So I started an organization in Basement, a nonprofit organization called One Economy. The premise being that, we need to make everybody a part of today and tomorrow's economy, with this belief that young people, it doesn't matter how much money you have in your wallet, or it doesn't matter the color of your skin. Young people are like fish in water when it comes to the use of technology. We had sort of this core belief. And so we started a nonprofit organization, 3 guys in a basement, the purpose of which was to help bring wider scale access to the internet into poor communities, then provide educational content and trainers to help community members become more expert in the technology. And if I've learned nothing else, it's better to be lucky than smart. And we started this company at a time where only 1.5% of the people in America, 1.5%, had a high-speed internet connection in their home. 1.5%. Today, it's more than 80%. And so we had this great tailwind doing this work. And we ended up helping to bring broadband and educational content into the homes of millions of low-income people in a dozen countries across 4 continents. And by the time I left, I was employing 2,000 young people. I had 2,000 employees between the ages of 17 and 25 who, because we trained them up, they in turn could become the technology trainers in their housing project, in their community centers, or what have you. And one of the wonderful things that we saw from this was by reaching these young people who may previously just have been working, if at all. They were sort of knuckleheads on the corner, but they were smart and they were looking to work, and give them a job that involved technology at all, they would work. We paid them $10 an hour. And then one thing we learned was after they worked for us for about 6 months, they almost all quit. And the reason they all quit was they got job offers that paid them $30 or $40 an hour. And it always played out the same way. They'd say, Mr. Ross, I'm so sorry, but I have to quit. And I'd be like, why do you have to quit? And they'd be like, oh, well, you know, Walmart is hiring for a $32 an hour systems administration, and they gave me the job. And I'd be like, that's a win. That's a beautiful thing. It was from that you know, we did a lot of work on the south side of Chicago, and a state senator on the south side of Chicago took note of note of the work we did. That state senator then went on to be a United States senator, and when he decided to run for president, he wanted to make technology a part of that. And so I ran technology and media policy for Barack Obama's first presidential campaign. That went well. And funnily enough, it went well at Hillary Clinton's expense. So after Senator Obama was the president-elect and I was working on the presidential transition team, assuming I was going to work in the White House, actually figuring out which job at the White House I was going to take, I was summoned to see Hillary Clinton. I'm like, why does Hillary Clinton want to see me? Does she want to like yell at me? And I went to see her and she said, Alec, I thought I was going to be president. And you know, I have a great many capable people who work for me, who were going to fill up all the sort of politically appointed executive offices in a Clinton administration. She said, now I need to get them all into one place, into the State Department. She goes, but I need to make one exception. She goes, I need one of you innovation people. And so I worked for her for 4 years. I must say, though, I did not innovate her email. I wish she would have given me that assignment. Things would have gone a little better. I was not the IT guy. I focused on using technology to solve sort of chronic national security problems. So I'll give you one fun and sort of one scary example. So the one fun example, though it came out of a very sad set of circumstances, is do you all remember the earthquake that took place in Haiti? Do you remember that? So that earthquake took place around 4:30 in the afternoon, and we had figured out the degree to which there was going to be death and destruction. And we got Hillary on the phone. She was in Hawaii, changing planes to fly to Papua New Guinea. And what she said, by tomorrow morning, when people are hearing about the news for the first time, and they got a cup of coffee in their hand, and they're listening to the radio, watching the TV, or got their laptop open, she goes, I want you to have a program in place right then, right at that very minute, so the American people can do something to take action themselves and be a part of the relief efforts. And so I was sitting there, it was towards the end of the day, and my team was global, so they were all over the world. So in my office, it was just me and 3 relatively young women. It was me, Katie, and Caitlin. And so I turned to Katie, and Caitlin, and I said, what are we going to do? We need to come up with something by tomorrow morning. And what one of the Katies said, well, we've learned about this technology that you can use to make donations by text message. You text a word to a short code, and the $10 can be added to your cell phone bill, and we can designate a charity. So I said, that's a good idea. So I called up like AT&T and got a short code 90999. And we said, if anybody texts the word Haiti to this code, add $10 to their cell phone bill and we'll send it to the Red Cross. And we thought we were pretty clever. We thought this was a good idea. We thought we would raise a couple $100,000 for the Red Cross. We raised $40 million in 2 weeks in $10 increments. I know it was a while ago, but raise your hand if you remember doing this. Text. Oh my goodness. And 40% of the room. This is me, Katie, and Caitlin. And my point in telling this, and I'm going to come back to this later, is Katie, and Caitlin were these young women who were a step and a half removed from something that the Secretary of State had asked for. And me being sort of the proper, at the time, white shirt, red tie, pinstripe suit, State Department executive that I was able to deliver this program that became like the ad age social media project of the year. And like Barack Obama went on TV after like 3 days when it was clear it was shooting to the moon, and told people to do it. Major League Baseball starts the game telling people to do this. All this happened, I got a lot of the credit because I was the face of it. But you know who deserves the credit? Katie, and Caitlin. But the key thing, my key point here, is that so much of this innovation is going to come in environments that are non-hierarchical, where what the great leaders are doing is they are making themselves open to the thinking and ideas from the most junior people in the room. And the question I ask myself, to be self-critical, I'm like, all right, if I had to stand up this program in 2 weeks as opposed to 12 hours, would I have established a committee with other guys with white shirts, red ties, and pinstripe suits? Would there have been processes that would have throttled down the innovation? Would Katie, or Caitlin had a seat at the table? I'd like to say yes, but I don't know. Something to keep in mind. Something to keep in mind that we're going to come back to. And when I think about this change, the change propelled by digitization, the change propelled by all of these new technologies, I keep coming back to this number 40. I'm 45 years old now, and when I think about myself as a 5-year-old, you know, an immediately post-toddler, I think pretty much everybody in this room, close to everybody in this room, was alive 40 years ago. So if you think back to the world of the 1970s to 1977, if you Google Fortune 500 1977 and bring it up, it is jarring. It is like an absolute graveyard of companies. The huge food company was this company called Beatrice. The largest innovator in science and technology was a company called Union Carbide. Uber, who was the Uber of 1977? You know, Fortune 100, commanding presence, innovating in transportation. Greyhound. Greyhound was a Fortune 100 company 40 years ago, during my lifetime. Here's what's interesting, 40% of America's GDP, 40% of America's GDP comes from companies that didn't even exist 40 years ago. 40% of the American economy comes from companies that did not exist 40 years ago. And if you're sitting there saying Apple, Microsoft, Walmart, nope, they existed. They were all startups, effectively. Walmart was a little bit post-startup, but it was still small. It wasn't in the Fortune 500. Microsoft and Apple, not part of that 40%. They were around. So think about that. 40% of the economy is being created by companies that didn't exist 40 years ago. And because I'm a really, really geeky guy, I started studying the Fortune 500 from 1977 to present. And what I saw was a lot of creation and a lot of destruction. I saw companies sort of shoot into the marketplace and into our lives. And I saw big companies, like a top 10 company in 1977 called US Steel, go completely to zero. And so as I was thinking about creation and destruction, I thought that the best description of this process of innovation and the change it brings on actually came from the artist Pablo Picasso, who said, every act of creation begins with an act of destruction. So what's next? What's next? We're in 2017 now. We've had a nice walk down memory lane. What's 2017 to 2027? Well, here's the frame that I think about it in. Land was the raw material of the agricultural age. Iron was the raw material of the industrial age. Data is the raw material of the information age. He who owned the land and controlled the land during the agricultural age had the power. He who owned the factories and controlled access to the natural resources during the industrial age had the power. He or she who own the data, control the data, or can harvest meaning from the data are those that are creating the industries and businesses of the future. Now, in an audience as sophisticated as this one, you do not need a primer on big data. Raise your hand if you think you know what big data means. All of you, thank you. But here's something I bet most of you don't know. 90% of the world's data, 90% of the world's information has been created in the last 2 years. 90% of the data produced during the totality of humanity has been produced since April of 2015. And in fact, if you take all of the data from the earliest recordings of mankind, excuse me, literally paintings on cave walls, all right? Paintings on cave walls to the year 2003. The sum total of all of the data from the paintings on the cave walls to the year 2003, we now produce every 2 days. Every 2 days we produce as much information as was produced from well before, well before we were keeping records of anything to 2003. And we do this through what is estimated today as being about 20 billion things, 20 billion devices of some sort that are sending or receiving a signal. These are our smartphones, our internet-connected laptop, the sensors in supply chains. Right now, there are about 20 billion of these things. In 3 years, April of 2020, not that long from now, that number will have gone from 20 billion to 45 billion. So the slope in digitization is going like this. And then think about that in interrelation to the fact that 90% of the world's data has been produced in the last 2 years. So when I think about chief learning officers in this context, I think about you're having literally Pacific Ocean's worth of data. And the question then for you becomes, how do you cohere it? How do you extract meaning from it? How do you actually get a structured data set that you can then develop an algorithm out of that brings any real shareholder value to your company? But what I wanted to do for a minute now is I wanted to just pick out an example or two or three of some areas, some industries, some tools that I think are going to impact the lives of pretty much everybody here in some way or shape as we go to a world that is absolutely awash in data. Most of the industries that have been turned inside out by data analytics are things that are principally rooted in information communication services. So things like journalism or advertising, or even running for political office, like the stuff that I and my colleagues did for Obama back in 07 and 08. There are going to be some, what I think though is that this is going to continue, and information communication services are going to be turned inside out in some ways that are going to surprise some people. And so let me ask you, how many of you understand 2 or more languages? Raise your hand, don't be shy, a lot of you. How many of you understand 3 or more languages? A lot of you. How many of you understand 5 or more languages? Okay, a couple hands. How many of you understand 10 or more languages? You understand 10 or more languages? You're amazing. How many languages do you understand? 10. You understand 10. You're kind of awesome. I've asked that question a couple times before, and nobody's ever had their hand up. I asked that question at the IMF, full of 180 people who do nothing but international development, and the highest I got was 9. You are impressive. Folks, In 5 years, you're all going to be like her. You're all going to understand 10 languages. Let me explain why. When I first started traveling abroad, do you guys remember those old sort of bilingual little dictionaries, those pocket dictionaries? Oh, do you remember you know what I'm talking about? You go to Italy, you need to go to the bathroom, you spend 5 minutes putting together a sentence with unconjugated verbs that you mispronounce, right? I need to go to the bathroom, dove il gabinetto? And what you hope is that, the nice Italian man just points, gabinetto. But if what the guy says is, allora deve scendere le scale, poi vai a sinistra, poi vai su, you can't get through that little dictionary. You're done, right? Now we have this thing called Google Translate. So you can whip out your phone, you can type it in there. Google Translate, by the way, it's all data analytics. Google Translate is a product of 1 billion translations done a day by 200 million people. That's what Google Translate is. And it's fine. It's okay. It takes, the 3 minutes it took you previously to construct the sentence. It's now 30 seconds to type it in. You still don't know how to pronounce it. But at least the verbs are conjugated mostly right. You say it. And if somebody responds, you still hope they just point. Because you can't be like typing in your phone, devi scendere le scale, poi vai su. It's not the way it works, right? 5 to 7 years. If you are in a place where you do not understand the language, you know what you're going to do? Pop in a little earpiece. You're going to turn on the microphone on your phone. And as somebody speaks to you in a language that you do not understand, the language you hear in your ear is going to be the language that you want to hear. And because of advances in bioacoustical engineering, it's not going to be Siri's voice. No, your smartphone will measure the frequency, wavelength, sound intensity, and other properties of the voice. And literally at the speed of sound with no lag, the voice you hear in your ear is going to be a very close approximation of the voice of the speaker, but speaking English, or whatever 9 other languages she wants to hear. Imagine what this means in terms of our workforces, in terms of globalization. One of the most poorly understood aspects of globalization is the role of English. When I was born, there were 300 million native English speakers in the world. So these are the Australians, the English, the Americans. There were 300 million of us, okay? There were 200 million non-native English speakers, okay? So that's 500 million people. Today, there are a little more than 400 million native English speakers and 800 million non-native English speakers. And so what this means is that when the Korean businesswoman meets with the Chinese businessman at a conference in Brazil, they speak English. English became this platform for international business. Excuse me. Imagine if language is removed almost entirely as a barrier in this, and what it will mean for business, what it might mean for certain of your businesses. There are other industries that I think are going to be unrecognizable and are going to contribute to, I believe, the promise and peril of the future. Most people who write books about the future, they're either utopian or they're dystopian. It's either, we're going to live to be 150 years old, happy, healthy, wealthy, and lacking for nothing, utopian, or sort of eyes closed, fists clenched, bedwetting dystopianism. I think both of those are wrong. I think life tends to be a little bit more up the middle. I think all these changes in science and technology, I think they make life a little better. I think they can also make life a little harder. In some cases, it's better for one type of person. In some cases, it's worse for another. And one example I think about comes with the autonomous vehicle. Now, I'm going to tell a story that does not reflect especially well on me, but I'm going to tell it anyway. When I first heard about Google developing a driverless car, I was just like, a car with no driver will never happen. I'm like, that's in movies. That's simply not going to happen. And I know the founders of Google, and I saw the two of them at a social event. And I went up to them, and I said, guys, a car without a driver, I said, I'm shorting your stock. I said, you're too rich, you're too bored, and you obviously aren't doing drug testing at Google. And one of them, we'll call him Google Guy 1. Google Guy 1 looks at me and goes, Alec, before you short my stock, next time you're in California, come to the Googleplex and actually look at what we're doing. I said, all right. 2 months later, I was in the area. I was in Silicon Valley, and I went to Mountain View. I let Google Guy know that I was going to be in the area. And so he set up a little demo for me. And he was out there, and we were in this parking lot. And he's like, hey, come check it out. And I look in, and there's no steering wheel. I'm like, okay. He opens the back door. He goes, get in. So I get in. He goes, put on your seatbelt. And I put on my seatbelt. And he then gave me the kind of grin that you can only grin when you're worth $30 billion. And he closes the door. And we start in the parking lot doing these little loops. There's no driver, there's no steering wheel. And I've got 14, 12, and 10-year-old children. And what I'm thinking at the time is, you know what, this is like one of those rides at a carnival or at the beach, which my kids are now too old for. And I'm like, good job, guys. You just spent like $1 billion on a kiddie ride. But then the car pulls out of the parking lot and it goes on the road. 20 miles an hour, 30 miles an hour, 40 miles an hour. And then it gets on a ramp to this road called Highway 101. Once again, I'm thinking about my children. We get on 101, and I don't like driving on 101 with both hands on the wheel. We get on there, we're changing lanes, we're doing this, we're doing that, and I'm like, somebody's going to die. I'm like, either I'm going to die, or somehow I'm going to live, and I'm going to kill the Google guys. Now, I do not know if there was a video camera in the back seat. If there was, these guys have leverage over me for life. This was not one of my cooler moments. And people see that there's no driver, and there's this gunk on the top of the car, these sensors and all this, so they know it's one of those. They're like, hey, it's a Google car, let's see if it moves. It was terrifying. But you can only be so freaked out for so long. And after about 10 minutes, I'm like, oh my God, it works. It works. And we eventually do a loop. We were going 101 north. And we do sort of the loop-de-doop that gets us around to go on 101 south and take us back to the Googleplex. And we get back to the Googleplex. And sure enough, Google Guy 1 is there with that $30 billion grin on his face. He opens the door for me and sort of smirks and says, so, you gonna short my stock? It was notable, I think, that it was yesterday or the day before, yesterday, that Google hit $600 billion in market cap for the first time. So why do I tell this story? I oftentimes tell people, my students, the executives that I coach, I say we tend to overestimate what's going to happen in the short term and underestimate what's going to happen over the long term. I think that this is actually different. I actually think that this is going to happen in 8, 10, 12, 15 years time frame, I think it's actually going to happen much more quickly than we think. Coors is already delivering beer between a bottling plant and a warehouse in Colorado on an interstate using a driverless 18-wheeler. And so think about, again, promise and peril. So I think about the promise. I'm like, all right, well, I'm a knowledge worker. So I like the idea of not being in a long commute to work. I like the idea of sitting in the back seat and working, reading, listening to music, talking to my kids, whatever it is. It's promising. Takes low value time behind a wheel and turns it into higher value time. But I also think about the #1 occupation in the United States for males. The #1 occupation in the United States of America for men is driving a motor vehicle. And if you think about it, our bus drivers, our FedEx drivers, our UPS drivers, the drivers of our 18-wheelers. Those are still very good middle-class jobs that pay a decent wage that doesn't require a college degree. So promise and peril in all of this. I also think about artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotics. A lot of talk about AI, and if you really want to get into AI, because it can be confusing, but if you want to get into AI, I will do a shameless plug for my book, The Industries of the Future, because I do think it's time, I did try to unpack this in a way that's not technical, but where, normal people in business who aren't engineers can understand its application. Here's sort of the short version of my thoughts on this. I think that because of artificial intelligence and machine learning, the robots of the cartoons and movies from the 1970s will be the reality of the 2020s. And that's really for two reasons. Number one is a mathematical breakthrough in something called mapping belief space. There are things that are historically very difficult robotic tasks, things like grasping. Grasping might seem really straightforward, but it's actually very complex to model out mathematically and to therefore program algorithmically. But breakthroughs in mathematics in just the last 2 to 3 years are enabling our robots from being dominantly two-dimensional beings into becoming increasingly three-dimensional beings. The second big development is the cloud. So let's imagine we're visited here in Bonita Springs, Florida, at the Hyatt by a robot from one of the movies in the 1970s. Let's imagine C-3PO walked through that door. C-3PO 1977 original Star Wars version, all right? Now, in the movie version of this, when C-3PO walks through the door, if he recognized that he had interrupted a speaker giving a speech to a room full of attentive people, he would have said, "Oh, pardon me, oh my, so sorry." And he would have then clambered off and taken a seat, right? Now, if you're super geeky, you might ask yourself, what would it actually take for a humanoid robot to have the cognition, to have the cognitive ability to recognize that it had interrupted a lecture, the ability to then speak and excuse itself, the sensory ability to identify an open seat, and the mobility to be able to then go clamber over and take that open seat? The answer, bluntly, is we're talking about $1 billion worth of hardware and software that would have to be whirring in that gold gleaming body. And that's why we don't have C-3PO. But remember I said we're moving from a world of about 20 billion networked devices to 45 billion networked devices? Our robots are going to be some of those connected devices. So the way this works, not in the movies, but the way that this works in 2025 is a robot enters a ballroom and is connected wirelessly to the cloud. You all know what the cloud is, right? Cloud is this place that has massive storage and computing power. So the C-3PO of 2025 will be connected to the cloud. No $1 billion worth of hardware and software in the gold gleaming body. He will ingest data from the room. It will be sent wirelessly to the cloud. He will then get instructions back algorithmically, all of this taking place in much less than a second, by the way. That will instruct him. C-3PO, you just interrupted a lecture. Excuse yourself. Excuse yourself in English. We identify an open seat in the 4th row. Take the seat, 3 over, sit down, be quiet. So what does this mean? And what does this mean in terms of workforces and in terms of learning? What it means is that the next wave of labor automation is not going to just substitute labor that is manual and routine. It's going to substitute labor that is increasingly cognitive and non-routine. So the first wave of labor substitution in, sort of modern America, go back 100 years, look at a picture of a port from 1917. What you will see is a swarm of men men with caps carrying things, right? If you go to the port today, there is just as many goods, and there are no men with big, strong shoulders. It's all being done by machines, doing work that is manual and routine. Fast forward. Next wave of labor automation was manual and marginally cognitive. Things like giving you your boarding pass at the airport, or the work of an ATM. You input a little bit of data, and it knows what you want. All right, we know who you are, we know what your flight is, here's your boarding pass. We don't need a human being with all that latent processing power between their skull to do that for you, unless you're flying first class. And that's another trend in all of this. Keep going. When we have very powerful AI stored and available on a software as a service base, being channeled into robotics or being channeled into the software at our desktop, what's going to happen, what is beginning to happen now is we're seeing labor substitution that is cognitive and non-routine. And this was really brought to life for me by a guy named Terry Gu, who runs a company called Foxconn. How many of you, please raise your hand if you have ever heard of Foxconn? Okay, so about 20% of you. Raise your hand if you own an Apple or a Samsung device. Just about all of you. Apple and Samsung do not make those. They're made by a company called Foxconn. Apple and Samsung don't make anything. They design things. Foxconn is this company, a Taiwanese company that sort of pioneered the model in coastal China for taking low-cost labor from the Chinese interior, bringing it to the coast, putting them to work in football stadium-sized factories where people then put together your Samsung and Apple devices for you, okay? And at the time that I was interviewing them for the Industries of the Future, I was talking to Terry Gu, and he goes, Alec, I have 973,000 employees. I'm sick of humans. He goes, I'm not hiring any more humans, I'm just buying robots. And I said, well, Terry, what do you mean? You're like the pioneer of the new Chinese labor model. You know, explain this to me. He goes, humans, no CapEx, all OpEx. Robots, all CapEx, no OpEx. And I'm like, Terry, I'm not as smart as you. Break it down for me. He goes, humans, no CapEx. Maybe if they're a manager, you buy them a computer for their desk. They get business cards, low capital, upfront capital expenses. He goes, but high OpEx. Every 2 weeks they want to be paid, and it never stops. And the longer they work for you, the more they want to be paid. He goes, robots, opposite, high CapEx. You have to buy the robot. He goes, but then it never gets a salary. You work it 24 hours a day. It doesn't unionize. It doesn't get pregnant. It doesn't get sick. It doesn't fight with the other robots. It doesn't get a job at another factory. The robot is my slave. And, you know, it sort of made my blood run cold. And so I write about this in my book, and a couple weeks after the book came out, he fired 60,000 people in one day. 60,000 people in one day. Fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. And so when I think about this, I say, all right, I'm not going to curl into the fetal position. I'm just going to ask myself the question, in a world with powerful artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotics, what do we need to be doing as a society? And what do we need to be doing as educators to make sure that the people who we are developing have the skills and attributes to compete in this world? How do we future-proof ourselves? How do we robot-proof ourselves? And a couple conclusions. I want to share a couple conclusions before we get into some question and answer. The first, I want to go big picture first. I want to talk about countries or states, societies. What are the attributes that our states and societies need to compete and succeed in this world that I've been talking about. And here's the way that I think about it. I think that the principal political and economic binary of the 20th century was right versus left. Are you conservative or are you liberal? Is it the political right or the political left? The economic right or the economic left? I don't think that's as descriptive anymore of today's world. Today, I think the tension is much more between being open and being closed. Think about Brexit, for example. Brexit was an argument between two different parts of the Tory party. That was not left versus right. If you think about the debate in American politics right now, the far left, Bernie Sanders, agrees with the far right on trade. So that says to me it's not about right versus left, it's about open versus closed. And what I want to do is I want to define open a little bit differently beyond just the free flow of capital, human capital and financial capital, goods and services, but also to say, in my sort of loaded definition of open, other things that I think about are upward economic and social mobility not being constrained to elites. I think about being rights respecting, the rights of women, the rights of religious, ethnic, and sexual minorities. And I think about in a more open society where religious and cultural norms are not set by a central authority. The sheikh is not telling you what the state religion is. It's not set by a central authority, an individual decides her or himself. And what I've seen in the 4 years since I left government, my work is principally, in addition to writing, has been focused on working with some of the fastest growing startups in the world. And what I see is that there is a cultural connection between the fastest growing startups in the world, where they are in Sydney, Seoul, Shanghai, San Francisco, Sao Paulo, Miami, Boston, London, Berlin, Tel Aviv. It doesn't matter. There is something cultural about these workforces and about their founding entrepreneurs where they are sort of hyper open. You know, they want this kind of openness and this kind of pluralism in their environment. In fact, they would rather work in San Francisco with incredibly high-cost labor, with incredibly high-cost office space, than go into the interior of the country to do it. Why? Because of the things that they optimize for culturally. And so I think a danger, again, it's not a utopian view, it's good and bad in all this. When I think that San Francisco and Shanghai and London have more in common with each other than they do with the people in the interiors of their own country. San Francisco is more like Shanghai than it is like West Virginia. Shanghai is more like San Francisco than it is like the interior of China. London is more like New York than it is like York. And so I think that the real tension geopolitically over the next, I think right now, is the forces between being more open and the forces between being more closed. And I do think that where innovation takes place will be where the human capital that imagines and invents it chooses to live. And I think that has been and will continue to be in the more open environments. Last point, wanted to focus for a moment on parenting. And so I wrote this book, you know, obviously from a professional perspective, but I also wrote it from the perspective of being a parent of three young kids, 14, 12, and 10 years old, as I said earlier. And my last question in every interview was always the same. I said, what are the skills and attributes that today's young people need to compete and succeed in tomorrow's world? And there were some different points of view. There were some different ideas, but I will flag two things. The first related to coding, related to computer science. And it's that, you know what, computer code is the alphabet that much of the future is going to be written in. And regardless of whether somebody's going to become an engineer, they still should be literate in that world. and that all of our kids, by the time they're 10 years old, should be in a computer coding class. Because if nothing else, if they never touch a computer again, they will have learned tremendous logic models, tremendous problem-solving models, and they'll understand the foundation of many of the businesses that are being built as data increasingly becomes the raw material of tomorrow's economy. And the second thing, interdisciplinary learning. Everybody says STEM, 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 science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It's like, yeah, that's fine. That's a good foundation. But if what you're actually trying to produce are leaders, in a world so suffused by all this technology, in many respects, what matters most in our workforces is that which makes us most human, and aptitudes that we associate with the humanities, from behavioral psychology to emotional intelligence to communication skills. So when I think about tomorrow's leaders, they are sort of rigorously interdisciplinary learners. They may have an understanding of something scientific and technical in nature, but they combine that with skills, domain expertise that we associate with the humanities. And I think it's already happening. People just don't know it. I give Facebook as an example. Does anybody know what Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, studied at Harvard? Yell it out, somebody. Psychology. He studied behavioral psychology and computer science. How many of you knew that Mark Zuckerberg was a computer science student at Harvard? How many of you knew he was a psychology student? Just him. So most people who think of Facebook don't realize that Facebook isn't just a product of computer science, it's also a product of behavioral psychology. That's where the real leaders are going to come from. It's people who are able to take both sides of their brain, skills and aptitudes from very different domains, combine them,